Many people are surprised to learn that researchers have discovered a single treatment that improves memory, increases people's ability to concentrate, strengthens the immune system, and decreases people's risk of being killed in accidents. Sounds too good to be true? It gets even better. The treatment is completely free and has no side effects. Finally, most people consider the treatment highly enjoyable. Would you try it? Welcome to Thrivology Lab podcast, where we explore the science, philosophy, and practice of thriving. Our goal is to help you create a happier and healthier life through education, application, and transformation. Your co-hosts on this journey are Phil Dunwoody, that's me.
And Neil Utterback, that's me. Phil and I are both on the faculty at Juniata College, where we teach courses to promote human thriving and well-being. Before we get started, Phil, where can folks find us?
Where can't they find us? Where are we? We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and frankly, a whole bunch of other podcast places. But Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. You can send us an email at thrivologylab@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Today's topic if you've been following the podcast, we've been talking about all kinds of things. We've talked about mindfulness and nutrition and doing hard things and exercise and purpose and meaning. And next podcast, we're going to talk about this whole model. But when you're done with all of those things, what do? Sleep. So when you're done with all the activities, sleep like a baby. That's the end sentence of part of our model. So today we're talking about sleep. The opening quote is from More Sleep Would Make Us Happier, Healthier, and Safer, a 2014 summary by the American Psychological Association. I say this about all the things we cover, that it's my favorite thing to talk about, but
we are enthusiastic about all these things. That's why we do a podcast, right?
But I love sleep. I love the research, and I haven't always, but we'll talk about that. So in today's podcast, we are going to explore what's the problem that we're dealing with sleep. What is sleep and why do we need it? We're talking about sleep and physical health with mental health. And then at the end, as we always do, we're going to offer some practical advice, some tips and tricks for improving sleep habits, such as keeping a sleep schedule, winding down before bed, and adjusting your light. So Phil, to get us started, what is the problem that we're trying to address here?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Research by the Center for Disease Control shows that 37% of adults do not get the recommended 7 hours of nightly sleep needed for quality health. This number is 77% of high school students not getting the 8 hours of nightly sleep needed for them. They essentially need more sleep than adults do. And, I think most of us, and I think for most of my life, that was not something I paid attention to. I'll sleep when I'm dead, as the saying goes, right? That there's too much to do in life.
And we hear that with our students, like even our college students. Right?
Yeah, oh my gosh.
If you see students that are consistently sick, they're falling behind, their mood is dysregulated. If you dig just ever so slightly under the surface, a lot of it could be solved with just focusing a little bit more on your sleep.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to cover today.
Yeah.
How much of this is actually a problem? So the opening quote indicates, this is again the American Psychological Association, that getting essentially for most of us it's an additional 60 to 90 minutes, because that's about on average what people lack in terms of meeting the recommended guidelines. Doing that would the research very clearly indicates it would improve your memory, improve your ability to concentrate, strengthen your immune system, decrease your risk of being killed in accidents. That's a pretty impressive list. Okay, so we usually don't talk a whole lot about financial costs. This is not an economics show, right? We're talking about well-being, but I think this is just to kind of lay out the importance of this problem, right? So this lack of sleep that we get on a daily basis that builds up this sleep debt. Rand Europe did a study, put together this report from 2016, Why Sleep Matters, the economic costs of insufficient sleep. And they estimated that sleep deprivation cost the U.S. economy up to $411 billion annually, which is about 2.3% of the U.S. GDP. Japan incurs 138 billion in losses annually, which is 2.9% of their GDP. Countries such as Germany, the UK, and Canada also suffer significant economic impacts, with reduced productivity, increased absenteeism being key contributors. Their team calculated that insufficient sleep leads to over 1.2 million working days lost annually in the U.S., making it really a pretty huge economic issue. And again, our focus here isn't economics. We're talking about health and well-being, but just to show kind of how broadly this impacts us, right?
What I didn't tell you this when we spoke yesterday, but so last weekend I drove to Indiana, and on my way there, I saw no fewer than 6 like semi-trucks completely just overturned in the ditch.
Oh, wow.
And one of them was an actual collision. The others were just completely overturned. And I thought, what is going on? And I don't know, obviously, but I have to think, given that occupation's drive, the sort of that their expectations of work, that might have likely been sleep related.
Yeah, I mean, they have put regulations in place to try and curtail that, because the evidence essentially has clearly shown that sleep deprivation makes it much more likely that you're going to get an accident. I mean, after you've been up for 16 hours or more, your brain essentially takes these micro episodes of sleep where your brain just kind of shuts down. Yeah. You can be standing and driving, and so they're short, but they're enough where if something critical happens, if the car in front of you stops, for example, you are essentially unresponsive during that time. You're just on literally autopilot. All right, so that same RAND Europe study also explored the connection between insufficient sleep and premature death, right? So related to car accidents and other things. Individuals sleeping fewer than 6 hours per night face a 13% higher risk of death compared to those getting the recommended 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Those sleeping between 6 and 7 hours have a 7% higher mortality risk. So that 7-hour point really does seem to be the breaking point. And that's actual sleep. That's not time in bed. We're going to unpack that a little bit later. And these elevated risks came from things like cardiovascular disease, strokes, and, as we just discussed, fatal accidents.
Yeah, and Matthew Walker talks about this a lot in his book, Why We Sleep. And I think if we could make a recommendation of one book to read, Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep was, I think, we'll talk more about it throughout the podcast in more detail, but just truly a comprehensive and impactful book. But in it, he talks about the shorter you sleep, the shorter your life. The leading causes of disease and death in developed nations, diseases that are crippling healthcare systems such as heart disease, obesity, dementia, diabetes, and cancer, all have recognized causal links to a lack of sleep. And so we've talked about all of this. We talked about metabolic health and our sort of mental and physical health. We've parsed them apart academically as two different things. But this system, the whole embodied system, is working on all of these different, it's nutrition, it's exercise, it's movement, it's communities, all these things, and sleep. They're all partnering to keep us alive, and yet we so often work against the very systems that have evolved to make us as healthy as we want. And so one of the things, we won't go into all of the various metabolic benefits of sleep, but essentially you're doing a whole host of repair functions while we sleep. I see this with like student athletes who work really hard in the gym and they work really hard at practice and they're not making the gains they want. It's like, well, where do you think you build the muscle? It's not in the gym. You're breaking your muscle down in the gym. You're rebuilding it through nutrition and, of course, then sleep. So you're doing all these repair functions. And again, to echo what you sort of said earlier, Phil, this comes from a 2014 paper, The Effects of Sleep Loss in Capacity and Effort. Approximately 70% of adults feel they get less sleep than they need. and on the average 6.5 during the week, and they feel like they need 7 to function. Adolescents between the ages of 10 to 17 need 9, but over half of them, of the 15 to 17-year-olds, almost a third of the 12 to 14-year-olds, and 8% of the 6 to 11-year-olds are sleeping 7 hours or less. And that is critical time when your body is building and creating the adult that you will be, right? And one of the things that happens during the day, we talked about this yesterday, is like being awake is just kind of toxic. It's really hard to be a human being and get through the day, and you're building up all of these chemicals, stress levels through cortisol accumulation over the day, testosterone, and all these things. One of the other things that builds up is adenosine, and adenosine is this neurotransmitter that builds up over the day to create what we call sleep pressure. And that sleep pressure is the thing that says, okay, my body is ready to go to sleep, I should go to sleep. And during sleep, that adenosine, as well as the other chemicals, are getting sort of purged out of the body so that your system is fresh for the next day. But one of the things that happens if you don't get enough sleep is that is not happening. And so you've probably experienced this anecdotally, but one of the things we see is people who are sleep deprived have less EEG arousal. That's the sort of electrical activity in the brain, which translates to a lack of focus, a lack of alertness, and it also interferes with dopamine transmission. So one of the quotes from that same paper, adolescent athletes who had insufficient sleep reported poorer mood and considered their drills and sport practice to be more difficult, and those with frequent awakenings avoided the most challenging exercises. So if we reflect back, we talked about the importance of doing hard things.
Discipline,
all those things. And we talked about it briefly in those episodes, but like being well rested gives you the capacity to do those hard things better. As you've seen, and we probably all experience it. I feel tired. I feel like I'm just going to shy. I see this sometimes myself in the gym, where like I don't go as hard on my workouts as I do because I'm tired. Right? You just don't feel like it.
And that's true for me not only in my exercise life, but just in my work life, where when I don't get enough sleep, I'm just so easily distracted. And so I get off on these tangents, and I waste so much more time. When I'm well rested, I'm just better at everything in my life. It's something that I've, this changes somewhat as you age, right? So the younger us, we were a little bit more robust. Right. You don't get enough sleep, you can kind of bounce back after a day. I feel it much more than I used to. And
I'm sure every generation has always said, I wish I knew then, right, what I know now. But if I could tell my younger self even just one thing to do better, it would have been to prioritize my sleep. But calling up on that car wreck thing, here's another statistic from that 2014 paper by Engel Friedman. People who sleep 6 to 7 hours a night, which is just shy of that recommendation, are 2 times as likely to have an accident. Those who sleep less than 5 hours are 4 to 5 times as likely to have an accident. And we came back from Costa Rica. Was this 2 years ago? This wasn't last year, was it? It was 2 years ago.
I don't remember if it was last year or the year before.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
A year or two ago, we came back from Costa Rica. And it's a fantastic week. It's an amazing week. But we are there, with students, and so it's wonderful work, but it is still work.
Yeah, and the day we fly back, we usually don't get enough sleep because we have to get up super early and drive to the airport.
Drive to the airport. Yeah.
So it is a day that, particularly the travel days, are days of insufficient sleep on each end.
So we drove back from the airport Saturday. I slept poorly Saturday night. My best friend's dog was being taken care of in Pittsburgh. So Sunday I drove to Pittsburgh, picked up his dog. So that's like 2.5 hours one way, 2.5 hours back. And I should have just not come in to work on Monday. I knew it. I kind of knew it right out of the gate, but I did anyway. And to that point, I just blacked out on the drive to work. I don't know. It wasn't very long. I just remember my eyes sort of closing, and I was going around this bend, and just for a few seconds, blacked out, but I drove the car up the side of the hill, completely flipped it 360 degrees, and I've got my dog, Chris's dog in the car. Thank God nothing happened to them. The car was totaled. I was completely disoriented, but it was entirely a sleep problem.
And you knew you were tired. I remember
And
you
I
saying,
knew I was tired.
You said something to the effect of, I knew I was tired, but I thought I could just muscle through it, right?
Yeah.
Which is often this is what we think. Like, now, I'll be okay. I just need to push through it, be tougher.
Yeah. Right. And that's so culturally ingrained in us. Like, you just, like, muscle through it, sleep when I'm dead, all of that.
Yep.
Like,
yep.
Yeah.
And this is big, one of the main themes of this podcast and the class we teach is to say, sometimes the societal values we are taught are not things that actually focus on our well-being. Mm-hmm. And that's a great example of that, where we're not really taught to value sleep. We're taught to be productive.
Right.
And it's a sign, in a way, of kind of toughness and commitment to work and other things. If you skip sleep to do that, well, I didn't sleep because I had this project and then I got up early, and that's a good thing. It's really not a good thing, because you're actually not functioning your best at work, at the things that you're trying to do. And of course, it puts you at risk for driving and all these other things.
And even if I look back over my life, like I'm a theater person. I sort of grew up doing theater. I'm probably more naturally a morning person, but I found this thing I loved that was pretty much of nights. So, I would we'll talk about caffeine and stuff, but I would, consistently have rehearsals at like 6:30 at night. I'd have a cup of coffee before rehearsal. You go through rehearsal, and then often it's sort of the habit, people go to the bar to have a drink or two to sort of decompress. It's like, so I've had this like chemical cocktail in my body, but I was also like really physically active. And I was young, so I looked healthy or I looked fit. But when I think back on how I felt, I know like I was frequently sort of chronically impatient, chronically distracted. I always felt like I was just running just on fumes all the time, but I just kept going because that's what everybody sort of else was doing.
Yeah.
And I think if I could go back and like knowing what I know now, and like I could have been so much healthier and happier with just ever so slight tweaks to some of my sleep behaviors.
Yeah, sleep is something it's always been pretty important for me. It's something I've paid attention to a bit, but for me the real turning point was reading Matthew Walker's book Why We Sleep. That came out in 2017. I think I read it. I think it was 2018. It could have been 2019, but it was right in that period. And I remember saying to people that my first reaction was like, "Holy shit! This book is a list of ways in which I've been killing my brain." And I'm joking / not joking,
right?
Because one of the big takeaways from reading that, the technical part of it is that we have this, as we're awake during the day, we have this buildup of amyloid in the brain, beta amyloid or amyloid beta. And the buildup of amyloid beta is associated with Alzheimer's, dementia. It's a normal part of being awake. It's essentially just waste product. And it is sleeping that flushes that. So in layman's terms, being awake causes a buildup of kind of toxic chemicals in your brain, waste, and sleeping is what purges that, right? And so, everything you do in life is going to be enhanced by getting the proper amount of sleep. And it was at that point that I started to actually track my sleep and realize that, I thought I was doing okay with I thought I had decent sleep hygiene, and it was by reading the book and then starting to track it that I realized that wasn't actually true, because I knew you were supposed to get 7 to 8 hours, which often meant I was getting in bed 7 hours before I needed to get up. But when I started tracking my sleep, one of the things I learned is that I get somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes less sleep than the amount of time I'm in bed.
Right.
So if I'm in bed for 7 hours, that means I'm getting about 6 hours of sleep on average. Sometimes, of course, 6.5, sometimes 5.5. And it was then kind of shifting that and trying to be more disciplined with my schedule. And again, the mindfulness which we've constantly talked about throughout this podcast. I'm aware more, especially when I do my morning meditation. If I haven't slept well, my attention is a ping pong ball. I feel it when I'm meditating because I am much less focused. And then, just as an anecdote, a good friend of mine, who I won't name names, but he was recently diagnosed with sleep apnea, and when he got the CPAP and started sleeping with that, he described it as just truly life-changing and transformative. That he had been essentially decades of he had a habit of napping every day, and there's research that shows that napping is good for you and whatnot. He felt like he had to nap, like he could not function. And when he went in and did the sleep study, he was not getting nearly enough sleep, and he's like, I have so much more energy. I can focus. I can think. I had no idea actually how much I was suffering because it was normal.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's, with so many of these things, we just get used to the state and we don't even realize really what a more thriving state feels like because it's something we haven't experienced in so long.
Yep.
So let's just talk briefly about kind of what is sleep and why do we need it. And then we'll go into kind of more of the research, right? So sleep patterns. Sleep researchers differentiate between kind of two main types of sleep: non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement. So rapid eye movement, this is where you dream, REM sleep, right? And so it's referred to as NREM and REM. You can break NREM down into 3 or 4 different stages. You kind of cycle through the non-REM and REM stages in a 60 to 90 minute, sometimes 120-minute window. And it's really important to cycle through those stages because they do different things. And as you sleep throughout the night, your brain doesn't equally prioritize NREM and REM sleep throughout the night. It actually shifts over time. So REM sleep increases as you move to the morning. Essentially, you have more REM sleep. All right, so,
and that's important too. Like that I think something I hadn't known prior to that book as well. Like, so it's not, if you get 6 hours of sleep, you're not just getting 6 hours of sleep. You're also getting a considerably reduced REM cycle as well. Like all of the benefits.
Especially if you're getting up earlier, right? So this depends on whether it's 6 hours because you stayed up late or if it's 6 hours because you got up early, because they actually will then affect differentially because the first half of the sleep night is the NREM. And so if you stay up later than usual, that's the part you're getting the biggest deficit in. If you get up earlier than usual, then it's the REM side of it that you're getting the biggest deficit in, which is interesting. So circadian rhythm, this is a general term that refers to kind of 24-hour patterns that happen, not just in humans, but plants and animals as well, but we're of course talking about humans. So you can think about this 24-hour changes that happen in our body and our mind. That has to do with hormone fluctuations. It helps us control things like, obviously when we go to sleep and when we wake up, but also when we eat, levels of arousal. There is a dip in the circadian rhythm essentially after lunch. This is why a lot of cultures have kind of siesta. They have a cultural practice of naps. A lot of researchers studying sleep and the circadian rhythm argue that is actually biologically hardwired into us. And if you look at people who sleep versus those who don't, or I'll say people who nap versus those that don't, or even better, countries who switch from like having a napping culture to eliminating that and going to more that standard 8-hour workday, you see actually a big spike in cardiovascular disease and kind of other chronic health conditions that we're talking about. It does seem that biologically we're probably supposed to have a period of nap rest in the middle of the day.
And I think there's an important clue in that word circadian. So if we break that down, like circadian, circa dia, about a day. Well, that's rooted very much in sort of the cycle of the sun. So when we look at, a lot of what Phil and I do is like looking back at some of our ancestral practices and hunter-gatherers. So if you look at sort of pre-industrial cultures, they, without clocks, without watches, without any of that nonsense, they start their day roughly after sunrise and go to bed a few hours after sunset. Well, that's roughly 10 hours in bed, which translate to pretty decent 8 hours quality sleep. And they're consistent by that because they're following really the sun, right? And there's some seasonal differences. And to your point, some of these siesta things happen in cultures in the summer more than the winter, but but what happens when we start getting artificial light, when we get this arbitrary 8-hour, 40-hour work week, right? We start, and watches and clocks, and we start saying what the day is rather than just listening to our bodies, listening to nature, and following what we evolved to do.
Yeah, and something that also comes up with circadian rhythm that's important is that there are, not only are there differences between people, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment, but there are differences as we age, right? So people know this with babies, and that they tend to sleep a whole lot while they're growing. They're again, where they're doing all this, they're building their brain and the rest of their body. That's incredibly energy intensive. It requires lots and lots of sleep. But we see with the circadian rhythm, one of the things, adolescence, it shifts later in the evening. So in younger children, it tends to be earlier, meaning they tend to want to go to bed earlier and they need all that sleep. Adolescents, high school students still need a good bit of sleep, but their natural schedule kind of biologically shifts into the evening. It's hard for them to go to bed at the same time that, say, adults would typically go. It would be the equivalent of adults going to bed every day at like 5 p.m. All right, that's a huge shift. It's just hard to force your body to do that when that's not your natural cycle. And there's a good bit of research now looking at schools. Right. So in a lot of school districts, what you have is that the high school students go to school first thing in the morning, and then the elementary students or primary school students go to bed later. Go to school an hour later. That's backwards from how the circadian rhythm seems to be biologically hardwired. And we see evidence that if you switch that, if you have the high school students start an hour later, about 8:30 or so, or at least no earlier than 8:30 is what the research suggests, that there'll be an improvement in their SAT scores, there'll be an improvement in standardized tests in math and reading, and there'll be a decrease in behavioral problems and absenteeism. So, I mean, it has quite measurable effects. And when school districts make this change, it's kind of like a natural experiment. You can then see these things change in the standardized scores, which is pretty amazing.
Well, and Matthew Walker talks about this a little bit too, like if we take all of that and also take like differences in people's chronotype, the sort of, am I a morning person or a lark, or am I an evening person and an owl? Like, why would we have evolved these different sleeping needs and these preferences? But if we think about it from a sort of a tribal perspective, that means there's only a few hours where everybody's out.
Exactly.
That somebody's awake at different times, which allows for protection of the tribe. So we often try to force ourselves, and to my sort of theater example, I forced myself to be a night person when I'm clearly much more preferential to mornings. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying we try to sort of shoehorn people into these experiences because of some arbitrary industrial mandate, and that's just not beneficial. And it's really sort of counterintuitive. Like, if productivity is the goal, then shouldn't we be doing the thing that's actually going to make us more productive rather than this thing that's clearly not?
Yeah, that was one of the things that was surprising to me when I first read Matthew Walker's book. I didn't realize that kind of, night owl, morning bird type person, that really is an individual difference that's fixed, right? That so if you are naturally a night owl, and you have a job, where you have to be somewhere at 7 a.m., am I getting up at 5, getting ready and then driving, that you can do that. But if you really are naturally a night owl, doing that shift, even on a regular basis, it's going to have health costs to you, that it is working against your natural chronotype, which, I don't think we'd appreciate that as a society.
Right.
people who are night owls kind of get a bad rap, like, oh no, you should be up in the morning. That is kind of, a virtue. It is valued, and you're lazy somehow if you're not. Actually, that's not true. It's differences in biology.
Yeah, we've covered a lot about sort of these sort of physical health benefits of sort of metabolic and cardiovascular impacts, some of the physical, but also just highlight the importance of sleep as a means of disease prevention. Getting regular, and we'll talk about this as well, but one of the other things that's coming out is the importance of that consistency as well as quantity. So, one of the this comes from the Japan Multi-Institutional Collaborative Cohort Study. This huge cohort, they had. In the entire study, they had over 92,000 people participating, and they were looking at just all kinds of things. It's just this large cohort where they can mine data on a whole host of things. In this particular study, they took 81,382 of those people and looked at their sleep, and then followed up almost a decade later to see check on their health and their sleep habits. So it's a huge prospective study of approximately 80,000 people, adult Japanese men and women, and what they found, and I'll try to unpack this a little bit. So irregular sleep and sleep duration of 6 hours a day, irregular sleep and sleep duration 6 to 8 hours a day, or irregular sleep and sleep duration of 8 hours a day, was still associated with a 1.2 to 1.5 fold increase in mortality. That's essentially 20 to 50% more likely to die, right? And that's the thing that really struck me in sort of Matthew Walker's book, because I felt like, well, I'm getting roughly 8 hours, but my consistency was all over the place. Sometimes it was 10 p.m. I'd go to bed, sometimes 8, sometimes midnight, sometimes 2 in the morning. Sometimes it was all over the place. But I would sleep in, or I was still getting 8 hours, but that consistency is the key. When all of so even in that cohort, you've got people who are getting 8 hours of sleep, but their schedule is irregular, still fall into that 20 to 50% mortality increase.
Yeah, and this ties back to the circadian rhythm. It's
right.
Because your body is trying to regulate hormones and everything else on a 24-hour cycle, and if your patterns are irregular, it's just hard for your body to do it.
And we don't have this study in here. I'll find it for the interwebs when we post it later. But and nobody is saying get less than 8 hours, right? But they have found that consistency seems to be a greater predictor of these health outcomes than even the duration. Yes, 8 hours absolutely critical, but even as critical, maybe perhaps even more critical, is that consistency. Yeah. Getting to bed and waking up at the same time every day. Like, you see this with students, like, oh, well, I'll sleep in on the weekend. I'll make it up somehow.
Yeah, I was also surprised to see that sleep disruption, there's more research on that now. So again, even if you're getting the 8 hours, but maybe you're sleeping with dogs.
Yep.
There are other, maybe, you have roommates. Maybe you're middle-aged and you have to get up and pee more than you used to, right? Whatever it is, the sleep disruption also has pretty negative, because it disrupts that sleep cycle we discussed earlier between the REM and non-REM sleep. And again, this is where all your body's repair functions happen. So it's, again, one of my takeaways from reading Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker's book. He said when the research started, the question was, what systems in the body are impacted negatively by lack of sleep? And over time, that has actually shifted to, are there any systems in the body that are not impacted by lack of sleep? That, again, everything, can you think about cellular cleaning and regeneration, all these things? Well, that happens mainly when you sleep. And so it makes sense that all of your mental, physical systems are going to suffer through lack of sleep when you think about it that way.
And, to some degree, we're sort of arbitrarily parsing out physical and mental, but maybe could you take us through some of the mental health impacts of sleep or sleep
Sure.
deprivation.
Sure. With that caveat, is we often give that the mental is actually physical. Any emotions you have, any feelings you have are actually neurochemical changes in the brain, things that cause inflammation in the body. Well, guess what? Your brain is part of your body. They cause inflammation in the brain. And we see, so we're talking about mental health, but it's not, quote, just in your head. It's actually physical. So emotional regulation and mental disorders is something we see related to sleep. So this 2023 study, The Importance of Quality Sleep and Its Relationship with Physical and Mental Health. This is a review of 52 studies published between 2001 and 2023. And I'm just going to read a short quote here summarizing what they found. The review found that optimal sleep quality, characterized by adequate duration, continuity, and depth, is crucial for maintaining both physical and mental health. Poor sleep quality was found to contribute significantly to the development and exacerbation of many health problems, including metabolic disorders, cardiovascular disease, depression, and anxiety. And the whole emotional regulation, this is very much what I notice when I don't get enough sleep. I'm grouchier, and I get upset over dumb things. I just have a more difficult time regulating my emotion. And if you think again about teenagers and how 70% of them are not getting the amount of sleep that they need, also think about how moody, right, teenagers typically are. Well, those things are actually connected. Mm-hmm. They would actually be less moody, better able to regulate their emotions and their mental health if they were getting sufficient sleep. And again, I mentioned this kind of sleep fragmentation, which is this frequent sleep interruptions. There's research showing that is actually also a really important factor. It's not just kind of the duration and consistency, but also how frequently you're waking up. And as a 51-year-old male who's getting up to pee more than I used to, I've noticed that's affected kind of my ability to feel well rested in the morning.
Well, and I love my dog more than life itself, but she also is getting up there in age, and she gets out of the bed, goes to the couch, comes back in bed, gets under the covers, gets out of the covers. She's up multiple times, and I'm just light enough of a sleeper that it always wakes me up. And this has been like this last 6 months, there's been this sort of disruptive sleep. But I've noticed, I'm groggier in the morning. I just don't feel quite as sharp as I would like to.
Yeah, and so another 2021 study, the relationship between quality of life, sleep quality, and mental health and physical activity in college students revealed that lower sleep quality significantly reduced quality of life scores while increasing symptoms of stress and depression. This is huge. Here's another quote from Matthew Walker's book. We estimate that more than 50% of all children with an ADHD diagnosis actually have a sleep disorder, yet a small fraction know of their sleep condition and its ramifications. A major public health awareness campaign by governments, perhaps without influence from pharmaceutical lobbying groups, is needed on this issue. So this is what I was saying with my morning mindfulness practice. When I don't get enough sleep, I notice my attention. It's just harder to focus. Okay, the article Emotional Regulation and Sleep, an Intimate Relationship highlights the strong bidirectional connection between our emotions, how we manage them, emotional regulation, and our sleep quality, suggesting that poor emotion regulation can negatively impact sleep, and conversely, inadequate sleep can exacerbate emotional dysregulation, impacting our ability to cope with daily stressors effectively. And so this is all the things we've essentially already been talking about. When we think about mental health, often we think about mood and happiness, which are yes, but we're also talking about things like attention and memory. And this is what we tend to refer to as kind of the cognitive side, not that emotions aren't, but for whatever reason we put those in a different category. And we do see some amount of cognitive impairment as well. It does seem that the younger you are, the less sleep disruption impacts your cognitive abilities, and as you age, this becomes kind of more of a factor, but especially, again, around vigilance tasks, essentially things that require sustained attention. So kind of, again, coming back to sleep disruption impacts our ability to focus our attention. And some of the research, so memory consolidation is the term we use to essentially say we're moving new information we learn from what you might call short-term or working memory into long-term memory. That process is called memory consolidation. And the hippocampus is essentially critical for this. The hippocampus is essentially one of the main structures involved in memory and memory consolidation. And what the research shows is that sleep is kind of critically important for helping to move that new information from what seems to be the hippocampus to areas of the cortex for long-term memory. So, this is kind of fascinating. You can do this with essentially MRI, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging research, where they can give people kind of face name pairings to memorize. You have to memorize a whole bunch of them. You then, half the people get a period to nap, half the people don't get a period to nap, and then you have to recall them later on. And the napping, not only does it make you better able to recall the things you learned that day, it also makes it easier to learn things after the nap. And the functional magnetic resonance imaging shows that when you're recalling the things before sleep, they are being drawn, essentially it is the hippocampus mainly that's being lit up. And when you're recalling things after sleep, it's the cortex. And so it seems as though they've moved. So one way, again, kind of layperson way to think about it, is that the hippocampus is this temporary storage location. So when you learn stuff throughout the day, that's where it goes. And, this isn't exactly accurate, but it's close enough. When you sleep, that gets moved to areas of the cortex for long-term memory. So if you don't get enough sleep, two things happen. One, you don't make the new memories long-term, right? So you didn't learn what happened that day, didn't get consolidated nearly as much as you would like. And your hippocampus is, you might say, clogged up, so that the next day you're having a hard time learning information. We've also been talking about attention, and attention is really the gateway to memory. You can't put things in memory without paying attention to them. And you can't recall things from memory without focusing your attention.
Well, I think that's such a huge takeaway for me as well. We think of sleep as this unconscious, I'm not doing anything.
It's a waste of time.
It's a waste of time. But the system is doing so much work to clean and repair the body, but also to make sense of that day. So there was a study with rats. They had rats run a maze, and then they had them attached to electrodes to see what part of the brains were activated when they were learning the maze. And in sleep, they found those same areas were active, but they were slowed down. It's as if the brain was like, let me make sense of what you did today so we can remember it tomorrow. And I think of our poor students who are cramming for tests. They don't, but they're staying up late, their sleep is erratic, and they're not using that sleep to embed those memories when they need them.
Yeah. Or shift workers, right? My wife works night shift. And so, she works 7P to 7A. And that's a hard thing to do when then on your days off, you're switching back and forth, right? There's a cost to that. All right, so practical advice. I think this is, we always try to,
leave you with some tips.
Right, because that's the lab part of this. This is what you and I are doing all the time.
Totally.
So melatonin is something I've played with. The research seems to indicate that it doesn't actually help with sleep. That I'll say it's not that it doesn't help, it's that it doesn't help very much. So taking, for example, melatonin before bed, it does make you fall asleep about 6 minutes faster, apparently, but doesn't make a difference in terms of your sleep duration or quality of sleep or any of that stuff. So what it does seem to be good for is helping to shift your circadian rhythm when you are doing things like shifting time zones. So I bring it with me whenever I travel abroad, and I know I'm going to have to adjust because it does seem to help me go to sleep easier in those situations. And the research seems to back that up.
And I would also say, like, I would caution people, because any kind of over-the-counter supplement, that's essentially what melatonin falls into, is this sort of supplement, which is very loosely governed or regulated by the government. So often what you're getting may not be what you think you're getting, because there's no way the government is going to monitor them.
Yeah,
so I say caution.
Yeah, no, so much so, because the amounts of melatonin, the research shows the amount of actual melatonin can be way under or way over. And yeah, there's very little quality control. Sleeping pills come up, and we're not medical doctors. Right. I'm not going to tell you to ignore your medical doctor's advice, but there is a big difference between sedation and natural sleep. And what a lot of sleeping pills do is something more of a sedative type effect. And again, alcohol kind of has this as well as a sedative type effect. And the purging, the kind of clearing your brain of waste that we were talking about, the buildup of beta amyloid that happens during the day, that is disrupted very often by sleeping pills, by alcohol. And so those are things. I'm not going to say you shouldn't take sleeping pills. Again, you talk about with your medical doctor about this. But I would say it shouldn't be your first go-to. You should try a whole bunch of other things that we're talking about here. And then if all else fails, then maybe you need to consider that.
And one of those things is getting sunlight as early as you can and as often as you can throughout the day, because your body is taking that sun as a cue to start the clock. As you build up the adenosines, you're building up that sleep pressure. So many of us, we leave our homes, we get into a car, we go into an office, and we get very little sunlight actually on our eyes, on our skin. And so as soon as you wake up, as soon as you can, going out for a walk to get some sunlight helps to reset that clock so that you're more likely to feel tired by the end of the day.
Yeah, so and again, traveling, it's good in every day, but especially if you're traveling, that's one of the things they say. First thing in the morning, if you can get some sunlight, it's going to help your circadian rhythm shift, because it's going to take some time. So we've talked a lot in this podcast about stress, right? And so one of the stress is this emergency response in the body to deal with some threat. One of the, as cortisol is released into the body as a stress response, one of your body's natural stress responses is to inhibit sleep. In other words, it gives you extra energy, because in an emergency, you might need to forgo sleep for a night or even two in a survival situation. Short-term emergency, okay, fine. But chronic stress, if you notice regularly that you're stressed, and most of us, right, jobs are stressful, families are stressful, life is stressful.
Right.
Being able to monitor that and doing things like the mindfulness practice and these other things we've talked about can really help. Exercise is wonderful for helping reduce your stress and improve sleep quality. So monitoring your stress, noticing when you are stressed, and trying to mitigate that using some of the tools hopefully you've learned in this podcast.
I would say a slight caveat to the exercise, you're going to feel more awake often after exercise. So doing it early in the morning, like I like to, so I'm awake during the day. If you're planning or need to go to bed, maybe doing the exercise earlier in the day rather than late at night, so that you're not sort of wound up after the workout and then have to sort of turn around and sort of
and it heats your body up
and it
too,
heats your
right?
body
so, yeah,
up.
You're not supposed to exercise before bed.
Yeah.
So yeah, good caveat.
So, and so then there's just some other routines. I think we're often easy to make a morning routine, this thing, but likewise doing an evening wind down routine helps signal to your body, this is what we do, we're getting ready for the sleep, I'm going to do what I do every night consistently, so you know what to do. And some of those are things like reducing the amount of light, particularly blue light from devices, TVs, laptops, such, making your life darker as it goes
a
towards
couple hours,
couple
absolutely.
hours helps to teach your body we're winding down. We're going to go to bed now.
It allows for that. The brain naturally releases melatonin to help cue that sleep cycle, and too much light essentially prevents the release of melatonin. So if you're all your lights are on and you just shut them off right before bed, well, your body has not had a chance to kind of build up the melatonin that would trigger your sleep.
I know sometimes we come across as, or I do at least, as a technophobe, but like artificial light didn't do us a whole lot of favors. Caffeine. Caffeine is the single most abused drug on the planet. It's the most traded commodity next to oil, I think. It's like huge. Like Starbucks, not trying to demonize Starbucks on every corner, but it's important to remember that caffeine appears like so many places you wouldn't even necessarily think of it, like dark chocolate and other food sources that it might, as well as the preponderance of energy drinks and coffee drinks and Frappuccino, Mocha Loco things, right? It's important to remember that caffeine has a 6-hour half-life. That means 6 hours roughly after you had ingested the caffeine, half of that caffeine is still circulating in the body.
Yeah, and Neil and I are not anti-cat, right? We both love our morning coffee, just to be clear, right? So, but I have also, and this is something that also changes with age. We tend to take longer to metabolize it as we age. So, I used to be able to drink more coffee and tea than I can today. I still very much enjoy it. I found that in the afternoon, early afternoon, where I used to drink coffee, that's a little too much for me now. It's a little too strong. I can drink a green tea, and then I'm okay for going to bed later in the evening. And this is another thing where there are individual differences. Some people metabolize caffeine in their body much faster than others, right? So just again, through the mindfulness, through kind of just being aware, you will know. I know, for example, if I am plowing through some grading at the end of the semester, I might have a cup of coffee in the early, maybe even late afternoon to get through the work. I know I'm going to pay for it. And so that's an exception and not a not a regular practice. Don't check your work email before bed. Or the first thing when you wake up, try and bin things. So, kind of this, whatever you're having, an evening ritual is a lot of, what we're talking about here. So for me, that often means because I play bass, I usually sit down and I play bass some. I sit down and read some, right? I have this kind of period of this wind down period where I try and keep the lights lower. I try and limit my screen time. And I don't do things that I know are going to cause stress. For example, I don't watch the news, right? I don't read the news in the evening because I find that disrupts my sleep, and the same with work email. So build a deliberate practice, because your body is a habit machine. It will recognize those patterns, and this is just all classical conditioning. This is conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning. Your body will then naturally start to prepare itself for sleep because it'll recognize the patterns.
And some of this also, we've pointed to this in virtually every thing we've talked about. Tracking it, at least for a while, for a dedicated time, tracking it in some form so that you know what's working and what isn't, right? So figuring out what you are doing, how is it working, and I'm a huge proponent of the quantified self movement, whether it's a Whoop or an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or whatever, or an Oura Ring. Like, I highly recommend some sort of, because there are lots of things I thought I was doing, but the data shows otherwise, or I thought I was getting enough and the data shows otherwise. And if that's a wearable is not in your reality, even like keeping a journal by your bed to note the bedtime and wake time and how do you feel. I went to bed, and just tracking that, because I think because we're asleep, we don't pay attention to some of the details around it.
So I was talking to a colleague about some of this who had said, he said, I've gotten 7 hours for decades, or in bed for 7 hours. And I thought I was totally fine. And after some conversations and readings, he's like, I shifted it to 8. He's like, I can't believe what a difference it's made in my life. Again, he thought he was fine. because that was normal. And so again, this is the lab part. Experiment with it. If you're, maybe add an hour, add 30, 90 minutes to your sleep schedule and see what it does for you. So, well, I think we've mentioned most of these kind of issues already, this consistent sleep schedule, reducing devices before bed. If you are going to use devices in the evening, have them shift into night mode, which does reduce the amount of blue light. And then things like, these sound really basic, but sleep in a dark room. And if you can't sleep in a dark room, an eye mask can help with that. The temperature, cold room. We actually sleep much better when the room is 60, 67 degrees.
And again, experiment with that too. Like I am like Princess and the Pea. Like a degree or two difference will absolutely affect my sleep quality. I notice it. And it's cold enough in my room that it's hard to get out of bed.
You don't like being cold.
I don't like being cold, but like I can't sleep if it's warm. It needs to be pretty chilly.
Yeah, and then hot shower is the last one. You're again, because you sleep better when your body itself is colder. Taking a hot shower will result in your body kind of homeostasis, will lower its own temperature. This is something I noticed myself. Because I typically shower in the morning, not in the evening. But sometimes I've worked out in the afternoon for whatever reason, I'm sweaty, and I take a hot shower before bed, and oh my gosh, I slept the few times I've done that recently. I've slept so much better. It has me wondering if I should switch to an evening shower ritual of just a quick hot shower before going to sleep. All right, so your challenge this week is to really be deliberate. Think about your sleep hygiene practices, all the things we've talked about, and start tracking your actual sleep in some way. If you're a device wearer, I certainly am. Like I said, that was kind of how I learned that I was actually getting between 30 and 90 minutes less sleep than time in bed. But if not, because for some people that makes them anxious and they don't, they don't want that pressure, then fine, keep a journal. But try and prioritize. Take a week and prioritize 8 hours of actual sleep, which means at least 8.5 in bed, by the way. Mm-hmm. And notice how you feel. See if it makes a difference. Play with it.
All right, that is it for this episode. Please subscribe to the Thrivology Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment or question on YouTube, and we will be sure to respond. And be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And if you have a question or comment, or if there's a subject you'd like to hear us discuss, please reach out to thrivologylab@gmail.com. Thrive on, friends.
Thrive on.